Oops, I did it again. I forgot to record an intro. So this gets to feel like an old Japanese video. Let's have a little bit of fun. We're going to be going into a greater depth into how to make these chrome oxide compounds. So in this, I'm going to be basically voicing over the video that we just saw on the main channel, but we're going to be looking at all the little steps and tricks and tips I learned along the way. Let's dive in. So the first thing we need is a mold to put it into. Now these ones that I sell with the strops, I just put those in a simple ice cube tray. Work really well, they clean off the top easily. It's a very, very simple one to make. So if you can grab yourself an ice cube tray, you're golden. But if you want something a little bit more fun, you can look up a candy mold. And this is a candy mold that has the carbonate compound that you can make. So normally you'd fill these with chocolate, but I'm going to be filling them with chrome oxide. Or you really want to get into it, you can make your own mold. And that's where I had these. My brother actually 3D printed these for me, so I could put them into this and make up the molds. I want to show you how I make this. So all the information on things that I make, the silicone and that type of thing, they're down in the description below, so you can find that down there. So let's actually go and look at how we actually make this mold out of silicone. To make the mold, I'm going to be using a 2-part smooth-on silicone. It's basically like an epoxy in that there's an A and a B part, and you mix them together equally, and you let them sit, and then eventually they come out into a silicone. The nice thing about silicone is that it only sticks to itself. So if you have an uneven surface, they actually go on there very well, and there's no need to prep them or clean them. It peels off beautifully. So later on you'll see where I have a piece of wood holding them down, and it actually took the form of the wood grain, but the wood grain peeled right off, and so I have this beautiful replica of the wood itself. So you don't need to worry too much about that. I'm going to mix it by volume, so I bring it up to the 3 on one and then the 3 on the other, and keep mixing until all of the color becomes homogeneous. This might take 5 or 6 minutes, but keep mixing. If you're going to have any problem with this, this is the point at which you're going to have problem. Spend all the time you need, mix it out thoroughly until it's completely gone, and then mix it a little bit farther. Once it has been completely homogeneal, once it's the same color all the way through, then you can pour it into your mold dish. For this, I'm just using a piece of Tupperware that I had, and then we can start working on the molds that will go into it. I had a little bit of concern about getting the silicone down into all the details of the molds. But I found if I brush it on ahead of time and then put it into the rest of it, I get that full detail. Otherwise, if I put it in there, some air pockets will start showing up underneath. I had my brother actually 3D print these for me, as he has a 3D printer, and one of these days I'll need to get another one. I sold mine years ago, but I need to get another 3D printer. They're starting to become more and more useful. Then I can pour in the rest of this. Now, if I was thinking ahead of time, I probably just would have poured it all into the dish and been okay with that, because I was trying to be clean and not getting too much on top, but in the end, it just wasn't worth it. It's easy to clean off the top of them. It's easy to peel off the excess when it all comes out. So at some point, I just realized, let's just dump it in. These also were floating, and so I needed to push them down so that they weren't, well, floating. I cut off a scrap of 1/4-inch oak that I had lying around, and then this would allow me to push all of them down evenly at the same time. So I can set it on top and then put a little bit of weight on top of that to hold it in place. And that's about all. It has about 30 minutes of working time, and then it takes about 6 hours for it to set. Unfortunately, I put the weight slightly off center, and so it started to sag to one side, and you'll see that at the end, but it wasn't too much of an issue. I would suggest keep an eye on it, and 5 minutes later come back and make sure the weight is actually balanced right. Then we can pop it all out. You can see here how the wood just peels off the silicone really nicely, and I've got the surface underneath. And I can pop these plugs out, peel off the excess, and you have a mold. That's basically all there is to it. For some of these, I could just peel off the little bits and pull them off. Some of them, the bit on top was a bit thicker, and so I could come in with a knife and clean them off. Just using a utility knife allowed me to get in nice and tight, and I use a bit of a sawing action to cut through it rather than just pushing it. It slices really nicely and is very workable. So that is the mold, but let's take this up to the kitchen and look at what we have to do to make it work. Now the recipe for a chrome oxide compound is really simple. It's just a chrome oxide and a wax. You can make a wax from just about any wax you want. I like to use beeswax because I have it on hand. A lot of people like paraffin and other types of wax, but the beeswax I really like. It's quick and simple. The chrome oxide as itself is very expensive, so making one or two is cost prohibitive, but making a whole batch of them, you can get the price down a little ways. I'll leave a link to these down in the description below as well. So let's take these up to the kitchen, melt them down, throw them into our mold, and see what we've got. First off, you need a double boiler, and I have one that's specifically a double boiler. The pot underneath has water boiling in it, and the pot on top then heats up to that. The nice thing about it is that it will only heat up to the temperature of boiling water. It won't heat above that, so you can keep a nice even temperature very easily. The first problem I ran into, and normally when I mix this, I put the wax in first, I let the wax melt, and then I can add the chrome oxide to it. Unfortunately, in this case, I got overzealous and I dumped the chrome oxide in first, and that just means that it takes a little bit longer for the wax to melt. Oh well, I can still mix it in and work with it. And I'm looking for the wax on the bottom to melt, and I want to put in a little less wax than I expect. That way I can balance it out a little bit easier. And if you only have a specific amount of chrome oxide, you don't have to go back and forth between the two. Here you can see it kind of gets this clay structure. It all holds together, and if your mold doesn't have a lot of detail, this is actually a really good point for it to be. You can press it down into the mold and it works very well. But I actually want to take a little bit farther so that it will pour into the molds. So I'm going to add a little bit more wax and make it a little bit more watery. Let it all mix down in, and you can see how it's starting to get here. It's a little clumpy. I'm going to clean that out a bit, but it will become a really nice fluid pouring substance. Fluid pouring, and yeah, it will pour nicely into the molds. I can spoon it over into each of the individual molds and keep going. The chrome oxide that I have listed below is enough to make about 4 of these. I have a supplier that I buy large quantities of it, so I can make 100 or so of these at a time, but that really doesn't work well if you're just wanting to make a couple yourself, so that's why I have listed below enough to make 4. Then I made another batch so I could finish off all of these molds and pour them all in. Normally I have a popsicle stick so I can scrape off the top, make them all flat, and makes them a little nicer, just makes them look better, not anything special. With this mold, I needed to do a little bit more modification into the future so it'll scrape off better. This mold actually scrapes off really nicely. I just want to make sure I work it down into all the corners, make sure I have the full detail of there, and then you can scrape it off and have a nice piece ready to go. This one, I want to play with the idea of using the big mold on the end. I don't know if I'll use that or not, but the smaller ones work pretty well. Here you can see working it down into the corners, scraping it off, and then we're going to let it sit. If you're in a rush, you can put it in the refrigerator and it'll be done in a few minutes, or I normally just leave them out on the counter for 20-30 minutes and they're ready to go and pop out. And that's about it. It's a really simple process. So now you have a mess you need to clean up, and thankfully once it's cool, most of the time it breaks off or it chips off, and so you can kind of scratch it off. Or you can throw it in the dishwasher. It does melt in the dishwasher, which I've done a few times. Just don't tell your wife. Or you can do what I do, just set this aside and use it next time and leave all the bits in here to be melted, and they'll melt down again and you can use them again. When it comes to the molds, then you can just take all these pieces, pop them out, and there you go. You have your carbonate buffing compound ready to be used. So we can set these out. Then I've got my new ones here, which I'm really looking forward to seeing these. Because any of this excess here you can break off and put back into the pot. But then you have these ready to use. So you can make a mold for any shape that you want. And if you're doing it, probably just need one. But for me, I make a whole pile of these to sell. So there you have it. I'm actually really happy with how these came out. They're a little bit more detailed, and I think the next batch I'll be able to get them out a little bit better. But I'm really happy with the results. Making the compound itself is not a difficult or complex thing. You just have to mix together your compound, your wax, put it into a mold, and voila, you have a block ready to use. It is very expensive if you just need one block, and one of these blocks will last you for a long time. One of these is probably 2 to 3 years worth of supply for me. So making them yourself may or may not be fun. But you may find something that you want that specific mold and go for it. Now I will be selling these on my website as well as the strops, and so if you want to see more information on that, go ahead and head over to my website. I'll leave a link to that down below. So that's about it for today. I hope you enjoyed this, and until next time, have a wonderful day. So if I had a whole bunch of these and I put them in a big room, could I call it a wax compound museum?